Hi, y'all. So today we're going to be going over race, ethnicity, and families. 1 second. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so with this lecture, we're going to learn about different racial and ethnic groups and how they're defined, how different racial and ethnic groups vary in their family values or how they structure their families. And we're going to have a better understanding of immigrant families and the challenges that they face and how they also overcome those challenges. And then we're going to learn about how intermarriage affects families. Right. So racial ethnic groups are defined by people who share a common identity and whose members think of themselves as distinct from others by virtue of ancestry, culture, and or physical characteristics. So who's a part of a different racial and ethnic group may vary based off different historical or social context. Based on social norms and context, people can redefine these groups or create new ones as well. So, for example, the term Hispanic or Latinx typically refers to people in the United States who can trace their family ancestry to Latin America. However, these terms are not widely used until after the 1970s when the US Census Bureau changed its demographic information to incorporate these specific terms. There's also, I just learned about this weekend actually, debate over the term Latinx. So some people believe that Latinx is a more inclusive term, especially for people who may be non-binary or androgynous or genderqueer. But there's also people who speak Spanish that argue that the term Latinx doesn't fit within their language. And so there's kind of a divide on exactly what that means. Another example of the shifting ideas about what is a racial ethnic group and how these are informed by historical and social context is the term white, which typically refers to European Americans broadly. However, understanding whiteness and the privileges that come with being white or being able to identify as white is just now being studied in family science and sociology. So our understanding of what it means to be white and what the culture and historical context of that is shifting. So I would definitely read up on that, especially in your textbook. Okay. So the economic shifts that occurred in the 1960s and 70s had a huge impact on, sorry, let me preface this a little bit better. So now we're going to dive into specific racial and ethnic groups and their histories and social context. So our first is going to be African American families, and the economic shifts that occurred in the 1960s and 70s, as we know, had a huge impact on African American families, especially with the civil rights movement, and then with the economic declines that occurred in the 1970s. So in 1960s, there was a huge economic boom in manufacturing jobs, which employed a lot of African American men who didn't necessarily have college educations. We also have the civil rights movement that opened up a lot of opportunities for African American individuals and their families. So there was a movement towards a lot of economic success for African American families during the 1960s. But those job opportunities began to slow and became less stable in the 1970s, and African American men started to lose their economic stability and their prospects. As a result, many African American men and women were hesitant to marry without financial security or decent job prospects, and this led to profound changes in African American families and their structures, which we're going to dive into now. So the economic shifts that occurred in the 1960s obviously had a huge impact in how African American families went about marriage or how they understood marriage. If we think back to our history of families, we know that African American families experienced challenges in ever-changing family structures due to slave trade in the United States. And there was also a high mortality rate, I should say, among African American men. As a result, most African American families were made up of just mothers and their children. And today this trend continues, but we'll dive into exactly why that happens or how that happens. First, the marriage rates among African American adults have decreased over the last several decades. This may partially be due to the lack of educational opportunities that are afforded to African American adults, specifically men. Black men are also more likely to be incarcerated than any other racial ethnic group. Overall, the discrimination, lack of opportunity, and the high incarceration rate among Black men makes it difficult for them to eventually marry, and there has been a decline in Black marriages as a result. Although most Black women postpone or choose not to marry, they will still choose to have children, which has led to an increase in non-marital childbearing among Black women. Overall, the stigma of having children outside of marriage has declined over the last several decades across all racial ethnic groups, and it's making it a more favorable option. This has led to a high rate of single parent homes who are typically headed by women. Although there is a higher rate of single parents, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are parenting alone. Grandparents will often play an important role in the parent and child's life and typically serve as another parent-like figure for the child. Overall, though, kinship ties are incredibly important for Black families. Something I do want to note before we move on to our understanding of research on families, specifically with minority families, we need to understand that our research is really limited. In the past, researchers have often taken a deficit approach to understanding racially diverse families, and they also do a disservice to these families by comparing them to white families because it tends to perpetuate racial inequality that we see. The field is slowly shifting towards taking an ecological approach, so considering all types of influences and factors um, of, of families and moving away from these comparisons of racial ethnic groups, but unfortunately our understanding is very limited. So I want us to kind of keep that in mind as we move forward. There is work being done. I think his name is Dr. Diedrich Williams, and he is putting forth theoretical frameworks for understanding how we can understand like race and how it plays a role in all aspects of a person's life. It's a very intersectional approach, but he does make an argument that we can no longer and should no longer compare racial minority groups to white groups of people. So if you're interested in reading more about that, I definitely look into Dr. Diedrich Williams' work. I'm pretty sure that's his name. He works for University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about gender and Black families. So Black men and women face discrimination and economic disadvantages because of their race. However, Black feminist theorists and researchers argue that Black women face additional disadvantages because of their gender. That's again taking that intersectional approach and understanding how different forms of identity can impact you at different levels. So Black women tend to make significantly less money when compared to white men, and make less money than Black men as well. And they also make less money than white women statistically. So again, if you look at that figure, you can see that for every $1 a white man earns, a Black woman is only making 64 cents for that dollar. And then again, when you compare it to white women typically make 73% per every white man's dollar, but Black women are making even less than that, 64 cents. So about a 9 cents difference, yeah. Black women are also less likely to be homemakers and more likely to work full-time because they are rarely able to afford a breadwinner homemaker dynamic, even if they have a partner and aren't single parents. So again, that wage gap is particularly hard for Black women. So in the 1960s, or since the 1960s, I should say, the number of Black families in the middle class has expanded, though, significantly, and the rates of college education have also increased among Black families. However, middle class Black families still make less money than middle class white families. Again, let's go back to that wage gap. In fact, for every dollar a white person makes, a Black person typically only makes about 76 cents, and that depends on gender again. This wage gap may explain the declining rates in marriage in the Black community because wealth, homeownership, and job security are considered important for the success of marriage. Many young couples are choosing to wait until marriage until they've reach those specific milestones or choosing not to marry at all. It's important to note that although the Black middle class is increasing, they are still facing racial discrimination in their middle class neighborhoods and communities because a majority of those communities are white. As a result, Black churches have become a major support for Black families in middle class communities. These churches often serve as what's called a mediating structure, which are mid-level institutions through which individuals can negotiate with the government and resist governmental abuses of power. So that can be churches, neighborhoods, things like that. These churches, though, often provide community and a sense of support for many Black families, and it's a part of kind of the culture of a Black family to go to church together. Yeah. So now we're going to move on to Hispanic families. I'm going to move my little screen a little bit. Okay, the term Hispanic and or Latino, Latinx, whichever term you prefer, refers to a large and diverse ethnic group and tends to lump together people who actually come from very different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. So we'll be covering different ethnic groups and cultures when we discuss Hispanic families. Some things to note before we dive in are the immigration patterns of Hispanic Americans. So Americans of Mexican descent are the largest group of all Hispanics living in the United States. However, Mexican immigration to the United States has decreased over the years due to stricter border enforcement, the declining Mexican birth rate, and improvements in the Mexican economy. There have been increases in immigration from Central America, though. Salvadorans have become the third largest Hispanic group in the United States, and Cubans have become the fourth largest. On average, though, Hispanic families are typically headed by women. However, there is some nuance in how each family is structured and exactly why that might be structured that way. All right. So about 35.8 million people of Mexican origin live in the United States, making them the largest Hispanic population in the United States. On average, Mexican Americans marry at a younger age when compared to other Hispanic groups, non-Hispanic whites or African Americans. Two-parent single earner families are more common among Mexican American families than among other Hispanic families. Mexican Americans also have a higher birth rate typically. The average number of births a woman has in her lifetime for Mexican American women is about 2 births, which is slightly higher than I think the 1.75-ish average for white American women. A potential reason for their marriage trends and birth rates may be immigration patterns to the United States. When immigrating to the US, most Mexican immigrants will already be married, and the average age of marriage in Mexico is younger than in the United States. Mexican Americans also grow up in a culture that values family and children, so having children is common and it's often encouraged. Also, having children at a young age or having children outside of a two-person or two-parent household is common. Again, when we look at Mexican American families and how they understand family, it's kind of a group effort. They definitely take the idea of it takes a village. So it's a communal process. Children are really celebrated in that culture. I saw that a lot in my teen pregnancy studies where most of my sample was Mexican American, and there was definitely, a celebration of having children, even if it was at a younger age. Along the lines of family values, Mexican Americans are more likely to have extended family live with them and live in multi-generational homes. Again, going to that idea that it takes a village, and also familialism is really strong in Mexican American households. Oops, went too far. Okay, there we go. All right. About half of all people who identify as Puerto Rican live in the mainland of the US, since Puerto Rico is considered a territory of the United States. Puerto Ricans also have a higher percentage of children born to unmarried women. However, many Puerto Ricans are in informal marriages, so that's why it might look like they have a higher rate of children born to unmarried women. It just might be that their marriages aren't recognized by the government. In Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands, consensual unions, which are cohabitating relationships in which couples consider themselves married but never had a religious ceremony or civil ceremony, is pretty common. So it's just that they don't have documentation to show that they're married, but for all intents and purposes, they consider themselves married. Immigrations from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras began in the 1980s due to many people fleeing civil wars and poor economic outcomes. In 1998, a hurricane hit Central America, and the United States granted refugees temporary protected status that allowed them to remain in the United States for a limited amount of time. And this temporary protected status, or TPS, has been extended multiple times up until just recently in 2019. As a result, currently immigrants who have been in the United States under this TPS protection are kind of in this legal limbo. They've lived here for so long, and yet now they're being told that they have to go back to their home country. They're not necessarily illegally here in this country, but they are not considered citizens, even though, again, they've lived here for years. They've probably raised their children here, or have multiple generations living here. But they are also not necessarily allowed to leave the US, because if they do leave, they might not be able to come back. So it's a tough situation. And there are some things that the government is trying to figure out on how to handle the situation, but it's a really tricky situation nonetheless. All right. Now we'll move on to Cuban Americans, and the first wave of Cuban Americans came to the United States to flee Castro's revolution and dictatorship. The US government allowed Cuban citizens to enter the country as political refugees. Despite the US government trying to resettle Cubans across the country, many immigrants chose to settle in Miami, specifically the metropolitan area, where they created an immigrant enclave, which is defined as a large, dense, single ethnic group. And it almost serves as like a self-sufficient community that's very similar to how neighborhoods or towns that they came from ran. In this like enclave, Cuban Americans typically speak Spanish, own markets and restaurants, and they'll often send their children to private Cuban schools to kind of keep up the Spanish and keep up their culture. I actually was able to visit one of these enclaves. It's called Little Havana in Miami. My husband and I went there for our honeymoon, and it was very, it was kind of like it was like walking through Cuba almost, because everyone spoke Spanish. It was all Cuban restaurants, all Cuban owned businesses. And there was a lot of Cuban culture kind of within just this neighborhood that we were in. And we would talk to people in the neighborhood and like ask them, like, they would ask us why we're here. We tell them we're on our honeymoon, and they would be like, "Oh, we're so glad that you like came to visit our town." We got restaurant recommendations. We went down to this market where the owner, the market that he owned, or the stand he owned, it was like a produce market where you could get fresh fruit. And he was telling us that he was the third generation to own that market, so it kind of been passed down through his family. And what was really interesting is a lot of people had a lot to say about Castro, because all of them would say, like, we came to America because, or our relatives came to America because of Castro. So they have very strong opinions about him. And that was really interesting to see. But yeah, it's very much a self-sufficient community. It's all Cuban owned businesses. It was really cool. And many Cuban immigrants were able to financially excel in the United States because, as I said, many families opened businesses and then as a result supported other Cuban businesses in their neighborhood. So when we were walking through Little Havana, everyone knew everyone down the street. So I would talk to one business owner, they're like, "Oh, you should check out this person's shop. They do this, this, and this." And they all knew each other, or they would go next door and like they'd be talking to each other. It was really cool. And many of their businesses are organized on a family basis. So business owners will often employ other family members and friends. And as I kind of mentioned before, they'll pass down their business to their children or close relatives. So they're able to kind of maintain this community and maintain economic support for their family, because a lot of the times one relative will own the business, they'll hire other people, or they'll pass down their business to relatives. So I went to the produce shop, his grandfather owned it, and then his father owned it, and then he owned it. And then down the road, there was an empanada and coffee shop, and it was two brothers who owned it, and then a lot of family members worked there. So again, it's very family-owned businesses, and they'll also support other Cuban businesses within their neighborhood. So it's very cool. All right, now we're going to move on to Asian American families. Less is known about Asian American families, and again, Asian American is kind of, again, one of those catch-all terms to describe a lot of different racial and ethnic groups. So there's that. And a lot of the reason why we don't know too much about Asian American families, their cultures, and kind of the differences between them, specifically in the United States, is because of the immigration rate due to, I think it was the Chinese Exclusion Act, that really limited immigration rates from Asian countries to the United States. And so immigration rates were modest prior to the 1965 Immigration Act, which kind of ended that cap of Asian people migrating to the United States. Since then, the number of Asian American families has grown significantly over the years, but little is known about them as the research is still trying to catch up. In general, though, Asian American families value interdependence among family members. They are more likely to live in multi-generational homes where adult children will provide for their parents, and their families will often pool resources. Again, if we think back to our history lecture, we learned that Asian American families specifically highly value closeness, children respecting their parents and taking care of their parents, and obedience in their families. So just think back to our history lecture, that still technically applies to today's Asian American families, but there are shifts towards individualism among these families. Okay. So let's talk about social capital and how it influences immigrant families and their success in the United States. So social capital is defined as the resources that a person can access through their relationship with others. For example, some people may get jobs or acceptance into college if someone they know, like a family member, is connected to that business or college. So if you think about alumni or notable alumni, sometimes they'll be able to get their family members into the college that they went to just based off their status as an alumni. In the literature and research on immigrants, social capital can be really important to an immigrant family's success in their transition to their new country. Having ties to the immigrant community and in that area can really help a newer immigrant thrive, especially in the United States as they transition from one culture to another. So for example, children of Vietnamese immigrants in Versailles, I think it's how you say it, village, did better in school than predicted. And when asked how they were doing so well, many parents and children mentioned that there was a Vietnamese Catholic church, and it started to offer after school courses and tutoring sessions. In the immigrant community would often hold ceremonies to honor high achieving students who went to those after school tutoring sessions to really celebrate them and their success in their new country, which was really cool. But they also had ties to their home country, which made it feel less alienating. So they still had ties to their culture and ties to their life before moving to that country. And then when we think back to our slide on Cuban Americans, most of the recent Cuban immigrants were able to establish businesses and gain support because other Cubans in the area would invest in their business and only support Cuban-owned businesses to kind of increase the economy among that immigrant population, which again was really cool. So when immigrants have a close-knit community, from their culture or who are made up of recent immigrants from their same country, they tend to support one another, and it really helps one another thrive in their new country, which is really cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about American Indian families. So again, we kind of covered this in our lecture on history, but we'll go over it again a little bit. So before the 20th century, kinship ties were a central part for most of our American Indian tribes. Today, extended family ties are still really significant to American Indian families and how they construct their families, because they offer them a sense of identity and support. So going back to your tribal ancestry, being close to your extended family kind of solidifies who you are, and really gives you kind of a grounding in these types of families. Today, only about 22% of American Indians live in tribal areas or other trust lands. There has been a substantial growth of Native Americans in urban areas and migration away from reservations. This shift may be explained by Native American population seeking more economic opportunities in urban areas. Native Americans are also considered an economically disadvantaged group, with most households being headed by single women. However, many single mothers do receive support from their kinship networks, and they tend to live near their extended family. So again, they have lots of support from those kinship ties. Overall, though, the research on contemporary Native American families is pretty limited. So again, that's another gap in the research we have. Okay. So now we'll talk about intermarriage. So before 1967, there were several states that outlawed marriage between white people and non-white people. But in 1967, the Supreme Court declared that such laws were considered unconstitutional with the Loving versus Virginia case. I think they just released a movie about that, but it was an interracial couple that fought for their right to be legally recognized as a couple and for their rights as a family. Yeah, I think a movie just came out about it, but I've heard it's really good. I haven't seen it myself. So if you want to learn more about that, there's that resource. Since then, the rates of interracial marriage have increased over the years and have become fairly common. However, some racial ethnic groups are more likely to marry people of other racial backgrounds. So, for example, American Indians and Alaskan Natives are more likely to marry a spouse of a different racial ethnic background, while white people are the least likely to marry someone of a different racial background. And you can see kind of this chart about who is more likely to marry someone of a different racial background. So again, whites are the lowest, American Indian, Alaskan Natives are the highest. A reason for this might be that some people might have a small percentage of American Indian or Alaskan Native in their blood, so they'll typically identify that as that. So even if they have like a small percentage of that, they'll sometimes consider that rather than consider themselves like multiracial or something like that. So that might be an explanation for it. Okay. Now we'll go over a brief recap of our lesson so far. So we learned that kinship ties vary across multiple racial ethnic groups, but kinship ties are especially important for minority racial ethnic groups. These ties provide both financial and emotional support for family members, especially those who recently immigrated to the United States or for single parent households. Most kinship ties do tend to be women-centered, which is something that I didn't know earlier, but they tend to be women-centered, especially when those families tend to be headed by single mothers. Overall, women-centered kinships allow for both financial and practical support. So again, these families are getting financial support, but they're also getting, childcare or, let me take your child to this event because my child's going, or things like that. Although we learned a lot about different families and cultures, our biggest takeaway can be the importance of having a connected support system. So that is our lecture on